All right, everyone. It is now 7 o'clock Eastern Time, and my name is Jean-Luc Cook. I am the CEO of the Nepean Riding Association here in the area of Ottawa. And on behalf of all the Ottawa EDAs who are coordinating a series of Q&As with all our leadership contestants, welcome, especially to our leadership contestant, Amita Kuttner. I would like to remind everyone to use the Q&A features of Zoom. If you wiggle your mouse and you go down to the bottom, there'll be a Q&A button. Enter your question for the candidate. And if you see some questions there that have either your question already asked or one that you would like to see encouraged to answer, please click the like button, and that'll indicate to me from the audience which questions I should direct to the candidate. So without further ado, let me introduce our leadership candidate. Amita Kuttner, who goes by they/them, is co-founder of Moonlight Institute, a nonprofit organization that seeks to create a framework for an equitable and just future. Dr. Kuttner holds a PhD in astronomy and astrophysics and MS in physics from the University of California, Santa Cruz, also UCSC, for those who go by the acronyms. Their research focused on black holes and wormholes. They served as critic for science and innovation for the Green Party of Canada from September 2018 to February 2020, bringing forward policy on artificial intelligence, emerging technologies, and data privacy. Dr. Kuttner has long been an advocate for diversity and inclusion, including leading women in physics and astronomy at UCSC. They co-founded the UCSC chapter of 314 Action, an organization dedicated to electing scientists and STEM professionals to public office, and ran the Canadian organization effort for Scientists for the Future. So, Dr. Kuttner, over to you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here. I don't know that I need to add any more to that introduction, but if you want me to, I could.
Sure. How about you go ahead and add just a little bit more, and this will give folks another minute or so to think up some questions and put them into the QA system.
Sounds good. I'll go by speaking about my leadership campaign a bit. So I'm really proud and honored to be running for the leadership, and I'm doing so because I have the support of a lot of people that asked me to run and encouraged me to step up to lead. And to me, it means representing all of them. So I see already that this is an exercise in representative democracy, and we're putting forward a collective vision of the future of our party that is centered around justice and equity, really digging into that conversation about decolonization, but also making sure that every single person has equal access and opportunity in life, and also wanting the party to be fully credible. So using the scientific credibility that I have and my experience with the scientific method to make sure that our policies and our party are truly evidence-based in a way that I don't think we've really seen in Canadian politics or politics in general. And then also hoping to bring that to the national stage and transform our country. And third, our most important pillar, in a sense, is preparedness. And that means being ready for the crises that we're already facing and the crises that are going to come our way, as well as the opportunities. And I think technology is one of those things that's a bit of both. And I also mean this in the sense that as a party, we should be ready for the elections far ahead of time and have the grassroots organizing necessary to be growing at every opportunity. But this is really personal to me because I lost my mother and my house in a mudslide when I was 14. So it's a personal driver of mine to make sure that everything that's coming down the road in terms of climate is something we're prepared for, and that we're not setting people up to experience the trauma, horror, and sadness that I did. So it's my personal goal to prepare everyone for that, and I think it would be a good opportunity to have someone with both scientific expertise and personal lived experience of a climate disaster on the national stage. And with that, I look excited to answer questions.
Great, thank you. There were a few questions that were submitted by email ahead of time. Some of them were directed to all the candidates. Some of them were directed to you specifically. I'll go ahead and ask one of the ones that was directed to you specifically to lead us off as more questions are starting to come in. This one's from Jill. The Green Party leader will hopefully become a member of Parliament. The male leaders of other parties have been known to talk over each other. What has prepared you for the occasional chaos of Parliament and national debates, and what might you still need to do to get ready for this part of the job?
What's prepared me more than anything to deal with the internal politicking of Canadian politics is, and the House of Commons, is the fact that I was in physics for a decade, and this environment is very similar. It is full of people that talk over each other and do not provide each other much respect, and you have to get and figure out how to be heard and respected in that environment. And then a lot of the work I did was actually helping people and training people to get the confidence to be able to feel their own value and worth. And in a sense, even though it wasn't representative democracy, be representatives of future generations that would hope to go into the field. So I found, weirdly enough, that experience in academic politics has prepared me for the real thing more than I was expecting. But there is a lot of work that I have to do. And I think one of those things is in preparation for the national debate stage, less so in the House, but more so in national debates, being ready to get my voice in there in a way that is respectful and not going down the same tactics of argumentation that they use, but making sure that we're just as firm, clear, and present in any discussion, but in a way that shows us for who we are. And I think other than that too, making sure that I practice my vocabulary in French so I'm ready to talk about every single policy.
Great, thank you. I guess that this leads into a pair of questions from a pair of submitters, Johan and Sylvie, and it is on the topic of bilingualism. So if you'll excuse me, I'll go ahead and ask the question in French. Comment allez-vous créer un vraie culture de bilingualisme dans notre parti?
C'est tellement important pour moi parce que pendant l'élection dernière, dans l'automne, c'était difficile pour moi comme porte-parole en sciences et innovation parce que c'était mon responsabilité de répondre aux questions des groupes et organisations qui demandaient des questions sur notre plateforme. Et c'était très difficile parce que c'était seulement à moi pour répondre à ces questions. Le parti aidait seulement quand les questions et les questionnaires étaient en anglais. Alors, même pour moi, comme porte-parole, c'était un problème. Et je pense que pour être vraiment une partie fédérale professionnelle, nous devons être proprement bilingues. Et ce n'est pas seulement dans nos communications et nos interactions avec les ACE et les bénévoles et nos communautés, mais aussi dans tout que nous faisons dans le parti, avec le Conseil fédéral et même les communications entre nous. Et je suis dédiée à aider avec ça autant que possible parce que c'est nécessaire, je pense. Merci.
Merci. The next question, I'm going to try and connect two of them here. One from Mark here on the webinar and Christine, who sent a question ahead of time. Mark pointed out that in a recent TV appearance that you stated that it is your view to defund the police will eventually lead to the end of the police. Christine then, in a separate question, and really the punchline is the same, that's why I'm connecting them, is how would you cost cut out diminishing police numbers by, let's say, 10 to 20% and replacing them with several community developers spread across city wards? How would you describe their job's mandate and responsibilities? This question is a nebulous one, and it's the role of police within society.
Okay, well then, as a nebulous question, we're going to get a long answer, I think, of it here. So why I support the ultimate abolition of police as we know it is because of the systemic racism issues. And from people that I've talked to that have worked with police forces and with individuals who are incredibly dedicated and intent on changing police culture, they've made progress, but they've never been able to complete what they've wanted to accomplish because of coming up against systemic issues. And so in the process of defunding and moving resources away and then replacing with other community support services and safety mechanisms, we do understand that there is going to be a need for some sort of enforcement. And policing, though, we must also keep in mind, is something that's relatively new in our history. And the RCMP itself was formed as a colonizing force. So we don't really have a need for policing as it is now, but we do know that there are some things, such as illegal gun trade, for instance, that are going to need armed response teams, but they should not be the same people that are dealing with community safety. And there are, looking at kind of resources on there, so there are a number of different ways to set up services to make sure we're protected. And I think it goes along with a number of other reforms. which includes addressing the determinants of crime, the reason that people participate in criminal activities in general, as well as decriminalizing victimless crimes such as drug use and sex work, and a couple other things, as well as reforming our prison system to not cause reoffense, as the case is in a lot of places, and ways of incarceration as punishment, but heading towards true restoration, giving everyone the opportunity to be helped to a place where they will not actually commit crime again. And when we've gotten to, through support, helping them to a place that's better for them. And then for those who we cannot actually make sure that they won't recommit, then they don't get to come join society again. But it's not that they're being kept away as punishment, but for their safety as well as all of ours. So those, I think those pieces are also important when we're discussing police reform. But the process of abolition and defunding is definitely not immediate. And though I do think you need to get rid of the whole thing and then add pieces back in, it still has to take time, because doing it suddenly without addressing the other pieces can be stark and can be or could be problematic depending on how it's done. So I agree in sectioning and basically the different supports that I would want to direct funding towards. And of course, from a federal policy perspective, a lot of what we would be talking about directly is the RCMP, and then working with local jurisdictions with their police forces, but it's not something that the federal government is necessarily going to be able to mandate or should mandate. But moving resources to education, to housing, to healthcare are some of the big ones. And in terms of the programs of support that would be directly replacing police, we're looking towards having mental health professionals be the ones that show up to mental health calls and other healthcare professionals there, as well as community safety organizations that are not about, violent enforcement or suspicion, but about the community working together to create safe spaces.
Great, thanks. In the top voted question right now in the chat is, how does the scientific method inform the work that you have undertaken in politics? And perhaps there's a segue that can be connected there with what you've just added.
Definitely. So far, science has influenced my experience in policy a couple ways. And the primary one is that I do not see that most policy is evidence-based and science-based. It's because there are important aspects to the scientific method that are never mirrored in policy. And those generally relate to the stating of assumptions and the intention. And sure, when you're doing a scientific experiment, you don't have intention, but you do have some sort of concept about what's going on, which is left out of policy conversations. So people will say, well, we used evidence. So they take some data or they take some concept or paper or study and say, well, I'm going to use this to influence my policy. But they're missing the heart. They're missing their intention. And I think that intention, which I would classify as assumptions, make the biggest difference. So the example that I use continually, because it's one that I've heard and I think fits really well, is that of housing. And often people say, well, we need more housing, so I'm going to support developers to build condos. And yeah, you get more units, but no one ever set out at the beginning of this conversation to define their assumptions and their ultimate vision that they're trying to achieve. And that goal, that outcome, that method of increasing housing is entirely different than one you would get if you set out at the beginning saying housing is a human right and we want to solve homelessness. And so both of those, you can say they're evidence-based, but to me, it's not truly evidence-based until you tie it back to the core. And so that's what I would like to see. And I think the other piece of that that's missing is the selective use of evidence and data, and a lack of understanding of how to actually analyze mathematics, probabilities, and data in general, so that people use it as a buzzword rather than looking at all the available evidence and seeing how credible it is and what is perhaps useful in different situations. So that's probably the biggest piece. The other one, for me, my experience in science has been around astrophysics, and the fact that I spent so many years with my head in space and really looking back at the Earth and seeing us as one whole interconnected family with everything that we exist here with, and being absolutely horrified that we're throwing away our amazing potential and harming each other to the extent that we are, not living in a way that really is prosperous in a way that it could be. So that has led me to doing this, absolutely. And I think for the policing aspect, evidence-based policy is totally the way to go. So the stuff that I'm looking at, because if I were to state my assumptions here, I say, well, I want to deal with issues of systemic violence and oppression, as well as crime. But I want to do so in a way that is driven by compassion. So I will look at the studies of how to influence our methods of policing from that angle. And in terms of kind of what I'm maximizing and minimizing, I want to minimize kind of direct changes or impact on people who are not currently negatively impacted. And I want to make the transition as smooth as possible, but also understanding the urgency of it, given that it's affecting so many people right away.
Yes, your background in astrophysics truly has given you probably the biggest picture a view of reality that I think anyone on the leadership contest slate has. To bring it back down to something much more personal, who would you consider as a powerful personal guide in the green movement?
I think a number of them. So personal as in I know them, or personal as in maybe a bit of both, but deeply respect them from a distance.
It could be historical, fictional. The question was not specific, but I think go to where your head is, go to where your heart is. I think was the intent of the question.
Okay. It's tough because I think there's so many. That's why I asked the follow-up. But right now there are a number of provincial leaders in Canada that I greatly looked up to, as well as in green parties around the world that are making a huge difference while, really embodying green values. And I see that, in New Zealand, as well as, some of the recent growth we've seen in Europe has been amazing. But in terms of people that I generally look to that have inspired me politically, and maybe, let me balance a few. I'd probably pick Jane Goodall and Nelson Mandela. So on the one hand, we're talking about justice and, dealing with systemic oppression in a pragmatic way that gets you what you want, but you also never give up your principles. And the other one is that deep, heartfelt connection to nature and our dependence on it, and how close we actually are and related to everything, that if we don't take that into account in how we go forward, and to me that comes back to ecological wisdom, without that, we won't be able to really go forward in a way that will last on this planet, especially from where we are now.
I think you've chosen two excellent choices there. Leaders in their own right, independent of everything else that goes on in the world. But what about you? How would you characterize your leadership style?
Oh, this one's so tough. So this came up in another interview the other day, but on my campaign, we've been making a bunch of Star Trek references. And so a lot of the people in the campaign have picked Star Trek characters from any series to represent their role, or who they kind of identify with, but then it doesn't have to match the, put person on the crew in the campaign. And I didn't pick my own character, but it was assigned to me by the people who worked on my 2019 campaign and the people on this one. And they gave me Picard. And I am beyond flattered that people think that that's my leadership style, but I'll take it.
I'm partial because of my name, but if I had to pick one, I'm probably more of a Geordie. But
yeah, well, I think the idea there was around, really putting trust in your team and consensus building, and also being driven by justice. But that's not a super political answer. I'm sure I could pick political leaders as well, but I'm good with that one.
Good stuff. All right. These questions now turn more to sort of areas of strategy. So for example, Erwin asked the question, is your top priority to get at least a dozen MPs elected? And if so, how do you plan to achieve that?
Yes, so definitely, minimally. I think what I'm actually aiming for is helping to grow the party to an extent that we have a solid long-term future as, one of the top few parties in the country. And I kind of see the immediate trajectory towards that as a little bit fluid, depending on when the next election shows up, for instance, because I think it changes things, because what I want to focus on is growth pretty much everywhere, and having a model of kind of where to focus and what to focus on that is not so set in stone, but perhaps is evidence-based as well, but takes factors into account like, well, to me, the derivative, rate of change. So places that we see rapid growth, we should really invest in those areas. But we need to be re-strengthening at the grassroots and giving EDAs and volunteers the toolkit, the expertise necessary to do community outreach, so that we are seen as trustworthy, knowledgeable, the carriers of our own vision for the future, that we're living the life that we would like to see. And so therefore others trust us, and we actually get to be known in the community. And in that way, eventually, perhaps not immediately, but hopefully doesn't take too many years, we'll actually have green candidates everywhere that are community leaders, and not somebody that shows up at election time that no one's heard of. And that's already the case in a number of places, and we've seen how well those candidates do. So I would like to get that replicated in different places. And then from a larger scale, I think we really need to have a national messaging strategy that can speak to every single individual from where they are right now, and whatever that means. And so that means really tailoring our messaging to make sure that it doesn't alienate everybody, or anybody rather, and that we get feedback from all the different regions about what they need to hear. And then we work with different subregions and different groups to say, how can we tailor what we'll never give up, our core, our values, our policies, in a way that can be explained in reasonable language to any person. And then sharing that toolkit with grassroots organizing. And then when it comes to actually focusing, perhaps to get a certain number of seats, and kind of, I would say, model building. So what are the different trajectories we can get given certain starting parameters for the number of seats, and depending on when elections are, type of thing. And then giving reasonable amounts of support to certain ridings for sure, but not too heavily focusing on any, and really kind of going for that overall long-term growth, but at the same time making sure that we're really aware of the potential we have at any given moment.
Great. And I'm an engineer by education myself, and I work in computer stuff. And I've always found, because the nature of the stuff that I do is often pretty thick for people to understand. And so the ability to create analogies, to explain it to those who aren't familiar with the art or the science of it, is an art into itself, that I always found lend itself very well to politics. So the next coming question was, how do you strategize your communication message to convince voters that moving to green energy production ought to be non-negotiable at this point? That is, what economic homework have you done to strengthen this argument?
So most of the economic homework that I've done has been related to circular economy, and a huge amount of it, there are a lot of different models out there that can work, and figuring out how to communicate that is, I think, the ultimate trick. When it comes to messaging, I actually think it's less about doing one's homework, although that's something I tend to do given my background. But it's more about the homework of finding out where people are and what their immediate concerns are. So for us, it's completely self-evident that we need renewables immediately. We need to completely change our grid, change our way of life, change our economic structure, et cetera. And we can find a good circular economic model that, to me, also needs to be just, and it needs to be really local based and have multiple components that really are something that's new to be introduced, at least in the Canadian conversation, though not so new elsewhere. And once we kind of have that, or even a couple of versions of that, then the trick comes to that message. But I don't think that there is ever a solid way to convince somebody of one's point if you come from the place that you are rather than the place that they are. So I would go for saying, okay, well, if for any given demographic or person that you're speaking to, where are they? What are their day-to-day concerns? What are the things they're immediately worried about? And how can you address their fears? And how can you give them hope? And so it's managing to connect the economic model and the concept of where we need to go to those things, the hopes and the fears of every individual. And I don't actually think it's that hard to do. It's just going to be a lot of work, but with enough people, we'll be able to have that. And those real conversations that start from a place of care are generally what people respond to well, because it's not something they're used to in politics.
Thanks. To the participants, if you do have questions for Amita, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Speaking of which, I will go to another Q&A question here from Felix. How do you plan to leverage the success of these provincial Green leaders that you mentioned earlier to elevate success at the federal stage?
Definitely working with them at the community level as well. So we want to show that they're people that have become trusted and respected because they're amazing and they're phenomenal, and the work that they do is so heartfelt. So what we need to prove is that we're the same, and that what they get from the Green brand at that level is something that will actually be replicated at the federal level. I think one of the hurdles there is convincing people that voting green at that level is safe. Excuse me, and it's not going to be, because of the strategic voting arguments, that we can build the momentum necessary. And in a way, wherever those Green leaders are, to make sure that we're working with them as much as possible to grow support between elections there. And then I would like to see, more collaboration. I appreciate that we really have separate parties. There are, collaboration between volunteers happens a lot already, but there is something to say about keeping a certain separation for the integrity of how we operate, and we are not authoritarian, and that's the value that really matters to me there. But in terms of conversation and collaboration and mutual support, I think is what I would want to offer. So, how can we help as a federal party to reinforce the work that they're doing on a provincial level? And in doing so, build relationships where it's not one way. We're not just asking for help or support, but we're willing to offer something in return.
Great stuff. In the TVO debate, there was an exchange on carbon pricing policy as we talk about Greens, because this is, as you've noticed, this is one of the most important elements of Green Party internal discussions, it seems. What is your view on that exchange that took place in the TVO debate?
It was interesting that we were getting into the details of it. And I stand by what I said, which was having that debate where I think people are not particularly always going to understand it. It's a great debate to actually have, and we need to figure out, what balance of different methods we want to use. But in terms of public-facing communication, it's not the thing that people are going to latch onto. What they're going to latch onto is whether they're experiencing an urgency around the climate crisis. So speaking to that heart, the feeling, the compassion, the experience, the empathy, those parts are what actually connect with people, not often the policy pieces. And of course, I love the policy pieces, but to me, it was a matter of front-facing versus internal communication and the discussions we have where. And it's great, though, that we're having it, because it also shows in that context that we do have an internal policy discussion, and we're not just going, oh, this thing or this thing, and just going along with it without some discussion. So a bit of both there. And where I kind of land on it is, pretty much any model can be effective if you implement it correctly or well. And I have really appreciated the cap and trade program, but I feel like right now, with the speed at which we need to act, it might not be enough. And when it comes to carbon pricing, I'm generally supportive of it as well, but I've found that the way it's implemented at the moment is not good, because it puts the burden on people in rural communities and individuals who, even though it's revenue neutral, it comes back to people far too late who are living really precarious lives, and it completely exempts large polluters. So if I were to be discussing issues, it's how do you make a carbon tax actually get us off the large carbon and similar greenhouse gas emitters quickly without having to burden any individual person? Or how do you implement cap and trade in a way that is actually going to see the rapid reduction in emissions that we need? And then, is there a way to use a combination depending on the systems that you're actually talking about?
All right, great. Next question from email. This one's from Murray. Given the continuing downturn in the economy and the transition away from big manufacturing as a source of domestic production and jobs, how do you see yourself and the Green Party championing the realization of green economies and businesses for Canadians, be they self-employed, mom and pop shops, and small business ventures?
Mm. Well, one of my favorite things about running green in the first place was the ability of us to really focus on discussing small business, because it really is one of the main drivers of employment and our economy in general. And I do think we need to get away from the GDP as a marker in general. And I think that will actually also help the conversations of green economy, because once we're talking about economies as we understand them, which are promoting well-being and long-term sustainability of both the community and the economy, of course, you can get to a place where you're discussing this more freely, and it is about helping the individuals in their lives and in their communities, rather than being worried about shifting around jobs numbers, and actually valuing people being able to find meaningful work. So that's kind of where I tend to in that conversation. But I think that it's really important to note, and something that's been weighing on me because of my experience in tech policy around AI and automation, is that we're likely to come out of this pandemic, or not come out of it soon, but kind of shift towards an economic direction where a lot of large companies in manufacturing, not just because of kind of downturn or even economic transition because of climate related concerns, but simply because there's going to be less incentive for people to hire back humans to do jobs. And we're going to see an acceleration of people not ending up with employment. So there is a stepped up urgency in providing people supports and retraining. And it's the perfect moment to actually start talking about what a people focused economy looks like, and whether that be supporting people and removing red tape from small businesses and local community economies, and how to even see the circles of a circular economy at different scales, but then also looking into making sure that we have some tracking of where our job sectors are going, what's growing, what's not, what do we want to invest in. Like, my personal choice, and I think it's important, is to definitely reinvest in healthcare and care for one another. That's something the government can help with. It also invigorating different industries that are green or clean, or however we want to phrase it, that are growing and do have room for people, but they're going to need the support in the interim and through training programs and education. And I think, again, when communicating about this, it comes down to a healthy mix of truth, which can be scary in this case. So you want to add in that piece where you're removing people's fear, and you say, well, actually, we have a plan for this because we don't want you to be left behind. And we want you also to be involved in the conversation of developing your own future, because it should not be prescriptive. I don't think it's a comfortable or healthy thing to be told what you're doing next, but rather be given opportunities and given options that you can pick which one is most appealing to you, but that you're free to choose, and you'll be supported no matter what path you take.
Great stuff. So this question is now from Christine, which I think follows on from this topic and your explanation there really well. Again, has to do with strategizing communication. How would you strategize your message to convince voters that a guaranteed livable income is required to start leveling the playing field in socioeconomic dynamics in our country? Again, this is about economic homework and how to present it to strengthen an argument.
Yes. So with a guaranteed livable income or a universal basic income, but I do tend towards appreciating the guaranteed livable income, because it's saying that we don't just want to hand out some basics, but we want to make sure that people always have a livable wage of some kind, or livable income of some kind. And that is the core important concept, but it also makes it a little tougher to create the systems to make it work. What I usually lean on in this case is that UBI or GLI is a solution to so many different crises at once. And so the same argument doesn't particularly work for everyone. Somebody, or a good number of people, really appreciate a UBI as a solution to inequality and poverty. Other people see UBI as necessary to deal with automation. Other people see UBI as a solution to the climate crisis. And right now, with a pandemic, a lot of people see the need for a guaranteed livable income as necessary in a way that they never have before. So I usually test the waters in the conversations that I have to see where that person is in terms of which one of those arguments is actually going to give the best response. And then I usually basically add another one on and say, well, if it's not good for this, but we still need it for this other reason. And usually actually 50% automation of jobs in the current pandemic is the strongest argument for it. And the strength has grown. And then there's the ways that we address the concerns with it. One of the biggest ones that comes up is the fact that it is a governmental program that somebody can remove. And that is legitimate concern because, right now or under any government, you can put in protections to make sure it's kept, especially if you're doing a guaranteed livable income with a more complex implementation and structure. It's possible, but it's also more difficult. So the pragmatist in me says, like, okay, let's just get in anything that we can possibly get right now because it's so urgent and necessary, and we'll figure it out later. But I actually tend towards saying that this is not an ultimate solution to these economic problems. We do come from a place with a prosperous enough society that we can agree to provide everyone's basic necessities. And it's honestly absurd that we don't. Food, housing, water, these are things that we have the ability to provide for people. I would also add internet into there. But that in the end, we actually want a system where we're not stratifying by people who only have access to a basic income and people who have some employment on top of that, because that's a really dangerous place where you actually can lose representation. So in order to combat that, my goal at any rate is to make sure we actually move to a place of further democratization of both work and the economy, so that we basically so some methods, I'm not sure on this yet because the research is currently being done and it's very fascinating on how you actually get individuals say and all people a say in the economy, and whether you do that by large scale dividend and then also having voting rights on what resources are allocated to what, or working to strengthen especially cooperatives and people having say in the companies. And again, that relates to AI. If you're having automation of a lot of work, what gets automated right now is going to be decided pretty simply by some large corporations, and there's nothing that we get from it. But if instead we as people have some sort of say in what things we want to get done. So, do we want the production of plastic goods, or do we want the production of medical goods, or do we want, the work towards cleaning our atmosphere? And so that's something, any of those could be automated. Which one would we choose? And what things do we value? Currently, we don't really have that input in it a way other than in politics. So that's the other piece that I inject into the guaranteed livable income conversation, is that this isn't the be all end all of where we go in terms of supporting people in economic discussion. It's just the beginning, and there really aren't drawbacks to implementing something urgently that will solve a lot of problems, and with the understanding that this isn't it. This isn't the end all be all of where we go.
Thanks. There's a question in the Q&A that follows on the question about economic topics. How would you apply the circular economy approach to the immediate federal budget and economic choices that are now being debated?
That one's tough, because we are currently still very much stuck in a mindset of interaction on the international scale that involves, reliance and debt gathering from multiple places in order to pay for what we have here. And so in that conversation, I think I would bring attention to the fact that the economy is very much a construct. And the way that we move things around and discuss things, especially on that level, don't always make perfect sense when you get to the bottom of it. And that right now, given the fact that the entire world is doing the same thing, we're not really taking very many risks. And the ultimate goal of circular economies is generally to have zero waste and infinite sustainability of your functions. So understanding that right now in the context of what we're doing immediately for the pandemic is not a step that is going to be circular in nature. But our response to it and our recovery from it can immediately head in that direction, and I think definitely should. but we know it's going to be a balancing act. I think in terms of introducing circular economies, it makes most sense to introduce it at two levels. One, local, small business, community level, and the other actually internally in businesses themselves, and looking at legislation or just encouraging carrot versus stick business to, especially large scale businesses, to look at the waste of their systems and how to take responsibility for it. And then also from the legislative angle, getting people to take responsibility and understand, and giving people the ability to understand where, where the impacts are from any given experience, product, economic interaction that they have. And that would also be an aspect to introduce into the conversation at that national level, especially on pandemic spending, because there is always an impact to it when you're borrowing or finding ways to shift around budgets to have more money. There's always an impact, and to be aware of those and communicate those, I think, is important. But I think, not get too scared that this is going to mean that we have worrisome budget deficits, because I don't think that in the end those are realistic concerns, except when they mean that we have reliance on human rights abusing countries that we need to extricate ourselves from. And that concept of self-reliance also relates to pandemic recovery, in the fact that we need to be as independent as possible, knowing that systems are a lot more fragile than I think a lot of people were expecting.
Right. On the, I'm going to follow through also on the question of interconnectedness and external trade. The question from Mark here in the Q&A. I've asked this of others, and I'm interested in your views. How would you manage international relationships with some of the more aggressive countries that have been in the news over the last year or so? Russia, China, the United States, various dictatorships, Saudi Arabia, etc.
It's a tricky one, and I think that Canada tends to act a little bit differently than it should, given our size on the global scale. And we tend to want to stand up for human rights in word, but we don't always tend to do it in deed. And I mean that in the sense that we're selling arms, or the fact that at home we're still incredibly oppressive against Indigenous people. So both of those things we need to address. But I think it is very much related to the economic point, which is that we need to have a certain level of economic independence in order to have leverage in those conversations. So I would go for a balance of understanding our size and our scale and our influence, with making sure that we actually are not endangering ourselves or our people by doing what's right. And that is economic, and it's also just a good deal of care in the way we work with diplomacy. Because I don't think that, just because of our scale and our size, that we should back down from the right thing or the right side of history. And when it comes to, especially China, dealing with oppression of Uyghur people, or also the protests for democracy in Hong Kong, it's not light, and it's incredibly serious. And we do have the potential to do a lot of good for people. But if we are not careful, in the sense that we haven't extricated ourselves from influence from that government, then we're taking risks we shouldn't be taking. So there's a lot of careful considerations to be made about the way that we treat legal disagreements, and especially companies and tech companies related to the government of China in that case. And in general, the way that we interact with other countries that are major players. We have the opportunity to set ourselves apart, and we just must do a lot better in terms of our own security and self-reliance to make sure that we're not going to get targeted at the same time. But I think if we also embrace ourselves as like a safe space, we can be a home for people that are being oppressed in other places. And I mentioned China, but that's also true for many places in the Middle East, and also Russia, because there's definitely a lot of oppression there, and to people that are part of my community.
Thank you. there's a lot going on in the world, and for those of us who perhaps are not involved in the depths of politics, you stop. You'd be very much forgiven to feel despair for what's going on elsewhere in the world. But
And I
we
don't
have,
think I have the space to accurately address how I would go into determining how to deal with any particular one foreign policy issue, because they're all so complicated and different from each other that one's direct response and the preparations that we need to get in place right now are quite different. So yeah, it's I guess I'm in a place where I'm actually considering that I might end up being prime minister, and it's a different level of responsibility from being an activist,
mhm,
and being able to speak truth to power in any position, but also knowing that you're playing a much larger game.
right. So, are there elements, for example, of the present federal Green Party policies and pillars that you feel need to be changed, revisited, augmented, etc.? And if so, in what way?
So a couple things, I think, looking at our policy book in general, there are things that in there that are outdated. They're not particularly wrong. It's just they don't make sense anymore for 2020. So we should revisit the way that things are structured and framed and what we talk about. Stuff I'd like to add are, or things I'd like to add are pretty much all related to stuff that's developing pretty quickly. And that's mostly around technology. So our policy book just does not fully reflect the world as it is now, and we need to update things. I don't think at the heart of it there's much I really disagree with. I would like to see nuance added in the way that we talk about certain issues so that we're not seen as pseudoscientific. And those include nuclear and GMOs. And it doesn't mean that I disagree with the stances that we've taken, but the discussions around them are often very one-sided and alienate people. So making sure that we get to a place where we're having a much clearer understanding of what we're talking about, what we're okay with, what we're not okay with, etc., I think will do us a lot of good. In general, I love our principles because they're what make me green. They're what define me as well. So I'm happy with them, but I do think it would be a really good idea for the entire party, so meaning our members, to get together and have a conversation about what they do mean to everybody. Because I think there's different interpretations, and it might be time to restructure their definition a bit to be more easily communicated. So I've been looking at the examples of how values are discussed with some of the Green parties in the Maritimes and also New Zealand. And the way that they phrase them, again, they're using the core green values of the global green movement, but they're phrasing them in a different way that applies and gets into modern language and the current discussions that are going on. Because sometimes they get to be a bit clunky, and I think mostly the issue is the multiple interpretations. And one of them I've thought about a lot is our value of nonviolence. And it can mean so many different things and how you apply that. And especially that comes up in foreign policy. And whether it means you're non-interventionist or whether it means you're interventionist in only some ways, or, the concept to me that I've been thinking about is anti-violence and wanting to work on the removal of systemic violence. And also whether that definition of nonviolence is a commitment to peace, and what that actually means. So that's one example in conversation. I think there's one of those to be had for every single principle, and it would be great for us to, as a party, get on the same page for that, so that we know what we're representing and how it also weaves itself into our vision of the future that we're going to be presenting to the country. And also, to me, I want to make sure that our policy process is really based in the values and in evidence, so that we are always capturing what it is that members are proposing for what they are intending. What does it mean? What value is it connected to? What are you actually trying to solve through a policy? So that when we go through and develop platform, and when we find the evidence to back it up and make sure that it's exactly how it should be, that we're not losing the intention of it in the words, and making sure that we're doing right by our membership.
All right, great. So we're at about 10 minutes out. So we're going to take a few more questions here, and then we'll probably close things out with a closing statement from you to send us off for the evening. Given the tremendous exodus of Canadian manufacturing and business opportunities to offshore countries, China in particular, how do you see yourself as a leader of the Green Party of Canada to champion the repatriation of businesses and domestic sourced goods within Canada that gives lasting, self-sufficiency, and increased employment.
Hmm. Yeah, I don't know that I want to repatriate any of those companies that have decided that that's the best way to support people and communities. But what I would like to see is a reinvigoration of Canadian-owned, Canadian-supported, Canadian-made everything. And that is largely to do with both self-sufficiency and local circular economy. So to make sure that we are providing for ourselves as much as possible and have the stable supply chains for everything. And there's always this worry about foreign investment and companies moving away. And I just don't tend to want to try to bow to their wishes and try to get them back so much as I want to give support to people here to replace the things that they used to provide for us in a way that we can take pride in, and that we also have the control over the quality and the products, their actual development and their economic as well as environmental impact. And in that, it will take a very careful look and support towards different industries, and that includes manufacturing, technology. One of my favorites is honestly aerospace, but I'm a bit of a space nerd, so that might be why. But these are all, that we have so many areas of potential, and it is the perfect opportunity actually with people leaving to say, well, you know what, maybe we can do a better job ourselves, and let's find out the way to support Canadians to do that rather than worrying too much about what's lost.
Great. Okay, I have two more questions here, and I think the last question will basically be your closing statement here. So I'll start with, which of the other 9 candidates do you see as potential partners in a team comprising of GPC leader and a pair of deputy leaders?
I'm not sure I'm ready to say yet, because I am seeing the candidates differently already than I did a couple months ago. And so I think I would like to see what comes next as well, and how people express themselves. And what I'm finding is so many of my opponents are absolutely amazing organizers, people with phenomenal ideas and talents. And we're going to need pretty much everybody as we're going forward. So to make sure that we maintain good relationships is paramount, but also I'm really not sure that I'm ready to say who my favorites are. I'm not sure actually it's appropriate for me to do so. But there are definitely ways that I am judging other campaigns. And what it comes down to there is, from what I can tell, what their goals are for the party personally, whether they're there for themselves or whether they're there to serve others. And right now there's a bunch of them that I would be glad to work with, and I have preferences, but I am not one to want to influence other people's thought, and I also want to give them all ample time to prove themselves to be who they are.
I think that was a very strategic but also insightful answer. So it encourages the audience to go out and to look at the other leadership candidates and try and read the tea leaves, as the expression goes, to figure out who was Amita talking about here. But
I think it is a bit strategic, because I want to keep those bridges being built, not burning them, for sure. And that's a responsibility, I think, of someone who's intending to be leader. But at the same time, it comes from my very deep mistrust of the use of endorsements. And I've been doing it, and I'm a little uncomfortable with it, because it's kind of what is standard practice, and people do listen to it. But at the same time, I'm not one to want to tip the scales.
Fair enough. All right, so the last question I have here, which is pretty much a closing statement question, and it's a very simple one, but it may also be one of the trickiest ones to answer. Why are you the best candidate for the GPC leadership?
It's a fantastic question. And I don't think that at the beginning of this leadership race, I fully knew the answer to it. And because I stepped up, because people encouraged me to do so, and because I felt like it was the best thing that I could do to further my desire for impact and positive impact and alleviating suffering in the world. But now I also see how fantastic my opponents are. And I see that many of them would make excellent leaders. But I have never been more convinced that I am the right person to be the next leader, because I believe I have exactly what it takes to bring us the exponential growth that we need. And that stems from the fact that it's rare to have the opportunity to have an astrophysicist lead a party. And that means something because of the scientific expertise and background that I bring right now, given the crises we're facing. It is pretty much never been so important to get a scientist in government and on that stage. But more than that, I actually think what makes me the right person to do it is my lived experiences. Whether it has been fighting for the inclusion of myself or advocating for the inclusion of others, or the fact that we're about to be facing a whole bunch of climate catastrophes. And it's the perfect moment to have somebody, especially representing the Green Party on the national stage, that has the experience of having lived through climate disaster, whose goal is to lead everyone through it with heart and compassion. And in the end, I think we all look for different things in leadership. But what it is that actually makes a leader is somebody who can inspire a nation, who can build bridges, who can connect with people and connect people to each other. And that can only be done through finding ways and knowing ways to connect to people individually. And through what I've been through, that's largely what I've learned. And on top of that, I can just bring in the whole cosmic perspective to show everybody a little bit of how they're so interconnected and dependent, but that we also have a beautiful future to dream of together.
I think that's a beautiful sentiment to for everyone to think on, right? We always talk about think global, act local. In this case, it's think cosmic, act local. I think it's a great message. So this is one of a series of Q&A webinars that the Ottawa area EDAs have been putting together. Each one is moderated usually by a different EDA. There's a couple where the EDAs have doubled up. And this evening we've had Amita Kuttner, Dr. Amita Kuttner, leadership candidate for the Green Party of Canada. If there's any last questions to come forward, I think the best avenue right now is probably to contact Amita's campaign team. When you received this email, there was a link in there for a Google spreadsheet with a list of all the registration links. There's probably by tomorrow, once I contact Amita's campaign team, the video for this webinar will be clickable there, and that way everyone can get an opportunity to rewatch this Q&A session and get to know the candidates better. So on behalf of the Nepean Riding Association and all the Ottawa area riding associations, thank you very much, Amita. This has been a great evening. I personally appreciate your candor, your insight, and your empathy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was great.
All right. I'll end the recording now, and I hope everyone has a great evening. Bye for now.